I was 72 years old the day I sat at my kitchen table in Ohio and realized I had $1,100 left in my checking account, and it was only the 9th of the month. I want to be honest with you from the very beginning because I think that's the only way a story like this is worth telling. I wasn't looking for an adventure. I wasn't dreaming of palm trees or white sand beaches. I was a 72-year-old widow trying to figure out how to make a Social Security check stretch across a life that had quietly become too expensive for me to live. What I didn't know that morning was that within a year, I would be living on the other side of the world, starting over completely, in a country I had never once thought about visiting. If someone had told me that while I sat there staring at that bank statement, I would have laughed at them. Not because it sounded exciting, because it sounded impossible. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how a 72-year-old woman ends up rebuilding her entire life on the other side of the Pacific, you have to understand who I was before any of this happened and what it cost me to get to that kitchen table in the first place. For 31 years, I worked as a nurse. I started on a busy medical surgical floor in my 20s, moved into the ICU in my 30s, and spent my last 12 years before retirement in hospice care. I want you to understand that about me because it matters later in this story. I spent my entire career taking care of people during the hardest moments of their lives, the diagnoses, the declines, the long nights, the goodbyes. I thought I understood suffering. I thought 31 years in healthcare had prepared me for whatever life could still throw at me. I never once imagined that the hardest chapter of my own life would come after I stopped working, not during. My husband's name was Robert. We were married for 44 years. He was a furnace and water heater repairman by trade, the kind of man who could fix almost anything with his hands, and who spent our whole marriage quietly fixing things around our house before I even noticed they were broken. We met at a church potluck when I was 26. He made me laugh so hard at that potluck that I spilled potato salad on my dress, and somehow that became the story we told at every anniversary dinner for 4 decades. We raised 2 children in that house, Michael, who eventually settled 2 hours away in Columbus, and Diane, who moved even further, to North Carolina for her husband's job. We had the kind of life a lot of people spend their whole lives hoping to build. Not extravagant, steady, predictable, comfortable enough that we never had to think too hard about money, which, looking back, I understand now was its own kind of privilege, one I didn't fully appreciate until it was gone. Robert and I used to sit on our back porch on Sunday evenings, and he'd say the same thing almost every week. We did all right, didn't we, Maggie? And I'd tell him we did better than all right. I believed that completely. I had no reason not to. Then, when I was 66 years old, Robert got sick. It started small, the way these things usually do. Robert complained of being tired all the time, and we both blamed it on getting older. He'd worked physical labor his whole life, and it seemed reasonable that his body would finally start protesting after all those decades of crawling into crawl spaces and hauling equipment up ladders. It wasn't age. Within 8 months, we had a diagnosis, and within a year, our entire life had rearranged itself around doctor's appointments, medication schedules, and a slow, steady decline that I recognized professionally long before I was ready to accept it personally. I won't walk you through every specialist's office, every hospital corridor, every difficult conversation with an oncologist, because if you've ever cared for someone you love through a long illness, you already know what those years feel like. You know the particular exhaustion of loving someone through their decline, of being both the wife who is terrified and the nurse who knows exactly what's coming next. sometimes before the doctors say it out loud. You know how the bills arrive quietly, one after another, long after the emotional cost has already been paid in full. I was a nurse. I understood the medicine better than most families do. I knew which questions to ask, which treatments were worth pursuing, and which ones were only going to extend suffering without extending anything that mattered. And it still wasn't enough to protect either of us from what those 4 years would ultimately cost. I want to say this plainly because I think people are ashamed to say it out loud, and I don't want to be ashamed anymore. I emptied our retirement account paying for things Medicare didn't cover. Supplemental home care on the days I couldn't manage alone. Medications that weren't on the formulary. Equipment insurance called not medically necessary that very clearly was. I refinanced the house once, quietly, without telling the children, because I didn't want them worrying on top of everything else. I sold my mother's jewelry piece by piece at a pawn shop 2 towns over so none of my neighbors would recognize what I was doing. Nobody warns you about that part when you're young and healthy and imagining what retirement is supposed to look like. Nobody tells you that loving someone all the way to the end can cost you almost everything you spent your whole life building. Robert died 3 years ago, on a Tuesday in March, in the bedroom we had shared for 4 decades. I was holding his hand. The hospice nurse who came that final week told me I had done everything right, and I believed her because I had been that nurse myself, dozens of times, for other families. I just never expected to be on the other side of that sentence. People think grief is the hardest part of losing a spouse. Grief is hard. But grief, at least, is honest. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. What came after Robert's death was harder in a different way because it crept up on me slowly, disguised as ordinary life. And by the time I understood what was actually happening to me, I was already standing in the middle of it. For the first year after Robert died, I told myself I was managing. I still had the house, paid off years earlier, back when we could still afford to think that far ahead. I still had my Social Security. I still had what was left of our savings, which by then was considerably less than what we'd started with. But I told myself it was enough. I told myself a lot of things that year that I needed to believe more than I actually believed them. Then the property taxes went up. Then the homeowner's insurance went up, twice in 18 months, because of some reassessment I never fully understood, and a claims adjuster who talked to me like I wouldn't be able to follow the explanation. Then one January, my heating bill arrived at $290 for a 4-bedroom house that had never really needed heating for more than 2 people, and now only needed to keep one woman from freezing in rooms she no longer used. I started doing what I imagine a lot of people my age quietly do, alone, without telling anyone. I kept the thermostat at 62 degrees and wore a sweater indoors, even in my own kitchen. I stopped meeting my friend Carol for lunch on Thursdays, not because I didn't want to see her, I missed her terribly, but because $18 for a sandwich and iced tea had become a decision I genuinely couldn't justify anymore, and I didn't know how to explain that to a woman who still had her husband's pension coming in every month. I started driving to a pharmacy 3 towns over, because the generic version of one of my blood pressure medications was $4 cheaper there, and $4, multiplied across a month, across a year, had started to matter in a way it never had before. None of these things by themselves were a crisis. A sweater indoors isn't a crisis. Skipping one lunch isn't a crisis. Driving a little further for cheaper medication isn't a crisis. Together, though, they were a slow leak in a boat I didn't know how to patch, and I was the only one on board who knew the water was rising. My son Michael called every Sunday evening, right on schedule, the way he had his whole adult life. My daughter Diane called most Sundays too, usually a little later, after her own family's dinner had wound down. And every single Sunday, when either of them asked how I was doing, I told them I was fine. I had spent my whole life being the person who took care of everyone else's hardest moments, my patients, my husband, my children when they were small and scared of the dark, my own mother in her final years. I simply did not know how to be the hard moment myself. I didn't have the muscle for it. So I smiled through the phone and I said I was fine, and I hung up and did the math again, alone, at that same kitchen table, hoping it would somehow come out different the next time. It never did. The morning that changed everything wasn't dramatic. I want to tell you that clearly because I think people expect a single terrible event, a scam, a bad investment, some catastrophic mistake, and mine wasn't like that at all. It was a perfectly ordinary Thursday. I sat down to pay bills the way I did on the 9th of every month, the way I'd done my entire adult life, and I did the math the way I always did. And for the first time, the math didn't work. I had $1,100 in checking. The next property tax installment was due in 3 weeks, and it was more than I had. My car, a 2011 Buick that Robert and I had bought together, the last big purchase we ever made as a couple, needed new brakes, and the mechanic had quoted me $600, money I simply didn't have sitting anywhere. My Social Security check, after my Medicare Part B premium came out automatically, was $1,740 a month. I wrote the numbers down on a legal pad, the same way I used to chart vitals, because seeing them on paper felt more real and somehow more manageable than just holding them in my head. I sat at that table for a long time. I remember the exact sound of the refrigerator humming in the silence, because the house had become so quiet since Robert died that I could hear things I'd never noticed before. I did the numbers again, certain I had made a mistake. Nurses are careful with numbers. Decimal points matter when you're calculating a medication dose, and that carefulness never quite leaves you, even decades later, even sitting at your own kitchen table doing arithmetic that has nothing to do with medicine at all. I hadn't made a mistake. I remember thinking, very clearly, with a kind of quiet horror I still haven't fully forgotten, I cannot keep living in this house. That thought terrified me more than almost anything Robert's illness had put me through, and I want to try to explain why, because I don't think it makes obvious sense on the surface. During his illness, at least I had a role. I was the nurse. I was the wife. I knew exactly what to do, hour by hour, even on the worst days. Sitting at that table by myself, 3 years after his death, I didn't know what I was anymore, other than a 72-year-old woman quietly running out of money in the house where she'd raised her children, done 100 loads of laundry, and once, decades ago, danced in the kitchen with her husband to a song on the radio, for no reason at all, except that it was playing. I called Michael that night. I finally told him the truth, all of it. The retirement account, the refinancing, the jewelry, the $1,100. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone, the particular kind of silence where you can hear someone trying to be gentle and honest at the exact same time. Finally, he said, "Mom, why didn't you tell us sooner?" I didn't have a good answer. I still don't, except that pride is a strange, stubborn thing, especially for people my age, especially for a woman who spent her whole career being the strong one in the room. Over the following weeks, we talked through everything as a family, the way I suppose most families eventually do when a parent runs out of road. Michael offered to have me move in with him and his wife in Columbus, and he meant it completely, and I will love him for that offer for the rest of my life. But I had visited enough elderly parents living in their adult children's spare rooms back when I still worked hospice to know what that arrangement can quietly do to a marriage and to a woman's sense of herself, even in the kindest households. We looked into assisted living for exactly one afternoon together at Michael's kitchen table before the numbers made all three of us go quiet. Even the modest facilities were running $4,000 to $5,000 a month, more than double what I had coming in, and that was before any additional care needs. I priced out a smaller apartment somewhere closer to Michael, something I could manage on my own, and discovered it wasn't nearly as much smaller in cost as I needed it to be. A one-bedroom senior apartment in a decent part of Columbus still ran close to what my current mortgage-free house was costing me in taxes and insurance alone, without solving a single one of my actual problems. I remember Diane saying something on a call around that time that stuck with me for weeks afterward. She said, "Mom, you always told your hospice families that quality of life matters as much as quantity. Maybe it's time you believe that about your own life, not just theirs." My own daughter, quoting my own professional training back to me, and she wasn't wrong to do it. I didn't have an answer that night, but something in me had shifted, quietly, and I didn't fully recognize it yet. I don't remember exactly how I first came across the videos. I think it started with something about American retirees living in Mexico, and then the way these algorithms work, one video led to another, and eventually I found myself watching something entirely different. Older Americans, mostly widows, my age or close to it, living in the Philippines, small, bright apartments, rent that cost roughly what my property tax bill alone cost me every single year. I watched one video, then I watched another, and I want to be honest with you, my first reaction wasn't hope, it was suspicion. I had spent 31 years as a nurse being trained to distrust anything that sounded too good to be true, because in medicine, it almost always is. So I did what I always did with anything important. I researched it the way I used to research an unfamiliar diagnosis, carefully, methodically, checking more than one source before I let myself believe anything. I learned about the tourist visa and how you could enter the country for 30 days on a return ticket, then extend your stay while you decided whether it truly felt right without committing to anything permanent. I learned about the special resident retiree's visa, something to consider later, if I ever decided to stay for good. I learned about the cost of a modest one-bedroom apartment in places like Angeles City or Dumaguete, and I compared it line by line on my legal pad to what I was currently paying in Ohio for heating alone, in a house I could barely afford to keep warm. I made lists the way nurses make lists about everything: healthcare access, distance to a hospital, because at 72 that is not a small consideration, and I refused to be reckless about my own safety the way I would never have let a patient be reckless about theirs. Cost of prescriptions, safety, climate, language, and because I no longer trusted myself to be objective about anything anymore, I deliberately went looking for the other side. I watched videos from people who loved living there, and then I watched videos from Americans who had moved to the Philippines and eventually moved back home, disappointed, homesick, or simply unable to adjust. I wanted both stories. If I was going to make a decision this enormous at 72 years old, alone, I owed myself the whole truth, whatever it turned out to be, not just the version that was easiest to believe. Michael was cautious when I brought it up, understandably so. Diane, surprisingly, was the one who eventually asked me the question that mattered most. "Mom," she said on the phone one evening, "what exactly is keeping you here besides the house?" I sat with that question for a long time after we hung up. I didn't have an answer for it either, not one that held up under honest examination. 2 months later, I sold Robert's old work truck, the one that had sat in the garage since his diagnosis, that I'd kept far longer than made any practical sense, because getting rid of it had felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. 3 months after that, I put the house on the market. The house sold faster than I expected. A young couple with a toddler walked through during the second showing, and I watched them stand in the backyard, already imagining a swing set where Robert's old vegetable garden used to be. I smiled the entire time they were there. Then I sat in my car afterward and cried before I even started the engine, not because I regretted selling it, but because I suddenly understood, completely, that our chapter inside those walls was over. I kept enough furniture and photographs to fill 2 suitcases and a small storage unit near Michael's house in Columbus. Everything else I sold or gave away, including things I genuinely never thought I'd be able to part with. Robert's tools, most of my nursing textbooks, furniture we'd bought together in our 30s that I'd assumed would stay in that house until I died in it too. It turns out you can part with almost anything once you understand, clearly and honestly, exactly what it is costing you to keep it. After closing costs and paying off what remained of the refinance, I rolled part of the proceeds into a modest investment account and kept enough accessible in savings to give myself real options for the first time in years. For the first time since I was in my 20s, my future wasn't already decided for me by circumstance. It was frankly terrifying. It was also, I slowly began to realize, a kind of freedom I hadn't felt in decades. I bought a one-way ticket, though the airline's booking system insisted I needed a return date, so I put down 30 days out, the way the tourist visa allowed. I told my children it was a trial. I think, secretly, some part of me already knew it wasn't. I landed in Manila on a Tuesday evening, and the heat hit me before I'd even fully cleared the jet bridge. Heavy, wet, immediate, nothing like anything an Ohio summer had ever prepared me for. I remember standing outside the airport with my 2 suitcases, 72 years old, completely alone, farther from my children than I had ever been in my entire life, and thinking, quite calmly, almost clinically, what have I done? The taxi ride to my hotel in Makati was unlike anything I'd seen in 7 decades of living. Motorcycles slipped between cars with inches to spare. Jeepneys stopped wherever the driver felt like stopping, with no apparent warning. My driver seemed entirely unbothered by any of it, weaving through traffic with the calm of someone who had done this 10,000 times. I, on the other hand, gripped my purse in my lap the entire ride like we were driving through a combat zone. That first night, alone in a small, clean hotel room, no television on, no music, nothing but the hum of the air conditioner. I sat on the edge of the bed and let myself feel exactly how frightened I actually was. Not excited. Frightened. I had spent my entire career being the calm one in the room, the person other people leaned on during their worst moments. There was no one in that room but me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I had absolutely no idea what I was supposed to do next. I won't pretend I didn't consider going home that very first night. I opened the airline's website on my phone and looked at earlier return dates. 3 weeks, 2 weeks, even, for one brief and humiliating moment, the following week. Nobody would have blamed me. My children, I suspected, might even have been relieved. I closed the laptop without changing the flight. I told myself I would give it one more day before I let myself decide anything. The first few weeks were harder than I had expected, in ways that had very little to do with money at all. I got lost twice trying to find a grocery store 2 blocks from where I was staying. I didn't understand which jeepney went where or how the fare system worked. And I stood on a street corner one afternoon, feeling more foolish than I had felt in decades. A younger version of me, the nurse who once ran a code without missing a single beat, would have found all of this humbling, maybe even a little funny. At 72, alone, 8,000 miles from anyone who had known me longer than a few days, It mostly just felt hard. There was a night, about 3 weeks in, when the loneliness became so complete and so heavy that I called Diane at 2 in the morning her time, just to hear a voice that had known me for longer than 3 weeks. She didn't complain about the hour, not once. She simply stayed on the phone with me until I could breathe normally again. That is the part nobody tells you about starting over at 72. It isn't one single decision, made once and then finished. It's hundreds of small decisions, made again and again, day after day, some days with something close to courage, and some days simply by refusing to give up before morning. But something else happened too. Something I genuinely didn't expect, and it came in the smallest possible package. My first week there, I ran out of one of my blood pressure medications sooner than I'd planned, and I walked into a small local pharmacy near my hotel, nervous, bracing myself for a complicated, drawn-out ordeal in a language I didn't speak. The pharmacist looked at my nearly empty prescription bottle, asked me 2 simple questions, and had the medication ready for me in under 10 minutes at a fraction of what I had been paying back in Ohio for the exact same drug. I stood outside that small pharmacy afterward, and for the first time since Robert died, I cried in public. Not from grief this time, from something closer to relief, the kind that arrives so unexpectedly it almost knocks the wind out of you. About 6 weeks in, I found an apartment, a small, clean 1-bedroom in a quiet building outside the busiest part of the city, close enough to a reputable hospital that Michael and Diane both stopped asking about it every single phone call, once I sent them the address and the hospital's name. The rent was less than 1/3 of what my property taxes alone had cost me back in Ohio, every single month. I remember sitting at a small kitchen table in that new apartment, doing the exact same math I used to do back home, and for the first time in years, the numbers left something over at the end of the month instead of nothing at all. I started volunteering 2 mornings a week at a small community clinic not far from my new apartment, mostly taking blood pressure readings and doing basic wound care for people who otherwise had very limited access to any health care at all. 31 years of nursing, I learned, doesn't simply retire quietly just because you stop collecting a paycheck for it. It was the first time since Robert's death that I felt genuinely like myself again. Not a widow carefully managing a shrinking budget from a quiet kitchen table, but a nurse, useful, needed even in some small, ordinary way, halfway around the world from where I'd trained. I began learning the little rhythms of my new neighborhood. The vendor at the corner market who always tucked an extra mango into my bag without charging me for it. The tricycle driver who waited for me outside the clinic on Tuesdays and Thursdays without my ever having to ask twice. Small things, none of them dramatic. All of them, together, slowly becoming something that felt, unmistakably, like the beginning of a life again, rather than the slow management of one that was ending. Diane came to see me for herself about 4 months after I'd arrived. She hugged me at the airport so tightly I could barely breathe, then stepped back, looked me up and down and said, "Mom, you look different." I asked if that was a good thing or a bad thing. She stared at me for a moment, then admitted she was still deciding. The first few days of her visit felt a little like an inspection, though I don't believe she meant it that way, not entirely. I could see her quietly observing everything. The apartment, the neighborhood, the market vendors who already knew my name, the way I moved through streets that had felt so frightening to me only a few months earlier. She wasn't only visiting Manila. She was trying to understand why her mother at 72 had suddenly wanted an entirely different life than the one she'd always known. By the end of that week, after coming with me to the clinic one morning and watching me work, after sitting beside me at the little market while the vendor slipped that extra mango into my bag without a word, she finally said something I've held on to ever since. She said, "Mom, I think I finally understand. You're not hiding from anything out here. You're just living." That was the moment I stopped feeling like I needed anyone's permission for the life I had built for myself. I won't pretend to you that every single day here is easy, because that wouldn't be honest, and I promised myself before I started telling this story that I would be honest all the way through. I still miss Robert every single day. Some mornings I wake up and reach across an empty bed out of 44 years of habit before I remember. I still miss my children in a way that aches, especially around the holidays, especially when Michael sends photos of Christmas morning and I'm sitting on my small balcony in 80-degree heat instead. Moving 8,000 miles away doesn't erase 44 years of marriage. It doesn't erase 3 grown children who used to live down the hall, or a career spent caring for other people's families at their most fragile moments. Grief doesn't disappear simply because your address changes. I learned that the hard way, in quiet moments on that balcony, more than once. But I am no longer lying awake at 3 a.m. doing math that refuses to work. I am no longer skipping lunch with a friend because a sandwich has become a decision I can't justify. I am no longer choosing silently between my heating bill and my prescriptions, wondering which one I can survive without this particular month. People sometimes ask me now if I regret staying longer than my original 30 days. I always tell them the truth. I came here thinking I was looking for a cheaper place to live out whatever years I had left. What I actually found, almost by accident, was a completely different way to live. One where being 72 doesn't automatically mean the interesting parts of the story are already finished. I spent 44 years building a beautiful, ordinary life with Robert, and I loved almost all of it, including the hardest parts, including caring for him all the way to the end, because that is simply what love asks of you sometimes, and I would do every bit of it again without hesitation. But I also spent 3 years after his death quietly disappearing into fear at that same kitchen table, and I don't regret leaving that particular chapter behind me. I wasn't running away from America. I wasn't chasing some fantasy of paradise I'd seen in a handful of videos late at night. I was a tired widow with a nursing badge, a shrinking bank account, and just enough stubbornness left to give myself permission to start over, somewhere new before I ran out of time to try. If you had told me at 69 years old, sitting on that back porch with Robert, that I would spend my 70s starting completely over on the other side of the world, alone, I would have told you that you were describing someone else's life entirely, not mine. But here I am, and for the first time in a very long time, I am not simply managing what's left. I am living what's next.